There comes a moment in life when you stop, not because the body demands it, but because the soul no longer wants to rush. It is not tiredness in the usual sense, it is something else. A kind of inner silence that becomes louder than the noise of obligations, and it is exactly then that questions arise which previously had no place. What do I actually still want? For whom am I living right now? Why do I carry all this further when it no longer belongs to me? Reaching 60, 70, or 80 years of age should not feel like a narrow boundary, but like an expansion. But to achieve that, one must shed ballast. The problem is not age, but the burden that accumulates over the years. It is invisible, undetectable on an X-ray, yet you see it in the eyes, on the skin, in the mood. It is the weight of old guilt, toxic relationships, promises made out of fear, and all the shoulds that were never real. This burden makes you more tired than the years themselves. It is not about starting over or reclaiming a youth that has passed. It is about letting go, clearing out, so that space to breathe remains, about keeping only what is essential, what nourishes, what lightens, what is true. For every day is an opportunity, not to become more, but to live better. And to live better in this stage does not mean more productivity, success, or recognition. It means peace, freedom, authenticity. It means no longer asking permission to be who you are. This is not a motivational speech, but a serious invitation to look closely at what you no longer need to carry. For as long as you breathe, you can choose, and choosing is not easy, but possible. That is the point, not the ideal, but the real adulthood, what hurts, but also frees. For the time that remains, whether little or much, deserves to be lived with inner lightness. A pattern often accompanies us so early that we no longer notice it later, living in constant asking for permission, as if every decision had to be silently approved in advance by parents, children, partners, friends, society. For decades, you have grown used to taking others' wishes more seriously than your own, to making decisions based on what goes down well instead of what your heart wanted. And this pattern still acts today like an inner voice that holds you back at the last moment before you take a new step. Maybe you want to fall in love again, live alone, move, travel, or simply learn to say no more often. But immediately the old question arises, and what will others say? This question is an anchor, an elegant form of self-censorship, for no one but you lives your life. No one pays the price of your renunciations. No one sleeps with your thoughts, your unrest, your silence. So why keep playing for the applause of others? The truth is, you do not need permission to be happy. Not now, not after all you have given, endured, survived. The respect you sought outside, you owe to yourself. It is not about rebellion, but about releasing yourself, stopping the request for emotional authorization for your existence. For when you have come this far, in the end, only one thing counts: no longer betraying yourself. Ask yourself, what would you do today if you did not care about others' judgment? What would you change if you stopped justifying your happiness as a luxury? Maybe it is not too late to live without permission this time, and sometimes you do not even know why you are so exhausted. The body seems fine, the duties are the same, and yet the fatigue does not go away. It is another kind of exhaustion. It does not come from work, but from relationships that have silently become a burden. Conversations that once were a refuge now feel like an obligation. People whose closeness once felt easy, but now gives nothing, and yet they remain, out of habit or guilt. These are the ones who constantly criticize, have expectations without voicing them, who keep telling you what you have not done, what you should have done, what they expect of you, without pause, without warmth, without mercy. Some have been there for years, others only show up when they need something. But all have the same effect. After being with them, you feel emptier than before. And yet you let them stay in your life, not out of weakness, but out of loyalty, to a story long past, because they were once important, or because you are afraid that distance will make you seem cold or selfish. But setting boundaries is not selfishness. On the contrary, it is self-care. Learning to clearly say, "I will no longer allow this," is as necessary as breathing. And it does not have to be dramatic. Sometimes it is enough to answer less, protect your time, not pick up a call, give yourself permission not to justify yourself. Relationships are not sustained by love alone. They are sustained by mutual respect, real presence, emotional care. If the whole burden rests only on your shoulders, it is not a relationship, but a burden. Maybe it is time to honestly examine whom you let into your peace, and whether he or she even deserves it. For to continue being surrounded by people who do not respect you is a slow inner burnout. And have you not earned, especially now, that your energy be treated as sacred? Not everything that hurts must be kept, but there are pains that settle in like a fixed part of your identity. Unresolved guilt, mistakes you have quietly punished yourself for decades, old resentment that accompanies you like a shadow. You live with these burdens without realizing how much space they occupy inside. They become part of the inner landscape, and from there they influence mood, decisions, even health. Sometimes it is concrete events, sometimes only the way you interpreted them. But the body does not distinguish between a real wound and one that has been repeated 1,000 times in the mind. Time alone does not heal. Only what is worked through, accepted, named, heals. Many people still feel guilty for things they did out of ignorance, fear, or pressure, not out of malice. And yet they carry this guilt as if they had committed an unforgivable crime, as if their mistake were their ultimate definition. Others cling to resentment, waiting for apologies, for reparation that will never come, and this waiting only hardens inside. Resentment disguises itself as justice, but in truth it is a chain. Some drag along decisions that were never truly their own, paths they walked for others. And so they live a double life, the one they have and the one they believe they could have had. That too exhausts. For neither of the two lives feels entirely real. The past cannot be turned back, but you can let them go. That doesn't erase what was, but it changes the relationship to it. An open wound becomes a scar, something that happened, something that shaped you, but no longer bleeds. Forgiving yourself, even just a little, is a deeply human act. And sometimes it's enough to pause, not to analyze everything, not to understand everything, but simply to stop feeding the inner voice of the accuser. At some point, it no longer fits with the rest of your lifetime to keep punishing yourself. Because not only the body grows tired, but also the soul. And no one should spend the last years of life as a prisoner of a guilt that no longer has any meaning. And when you finally lay down this burden, what comes is not emptiness, but relief. And this relief doesn't need grand words. It shows itself in the chest, in the silence that no longer hurts, in the mental peace that finally arrives. For a long time, it was responsibility that carried you, the one who manages everything, endures everything, accomplishes everything, sometimes out of love, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of sheer habit. And it wasn't wrong to be strong, it wasn't wrong to support others when no one else could. But eventually this role begins to press down heavier than it holds up. When it's no longer about caring, but about not knowing how to stop caring. When strength becomes a mask, a role that no longer reflects you, but which no one allows you to put down. Then it's a trap. An emotional trap, many know. Always being seen as the one who can handle everything. And from there it's easy to forget yourself, because there is always something to do for others, because there is always someone who needs something, because there is always an urgency from outside that seems more important than your own life. But time passes, and the body begins to show signs, not only physical ones, but deeper: exhaustion, lack of enthusiasm, loss of meaning, a quiet sadness without a name. You're still here, but not fully. Many of these responsibilities aren't even truly yours. You took them on yourself because no one else would have, or because you thought that way you'd be more valued. But that's over. Today, holding on to what doesn't belong to you only means moving further away from yourself. There are promises you no longer have to fulfill. Roles that were once helpful, but today only bring rigidity. Duty can also be a prison if it's never questioned, if it only repeats itself out of habit, without connection to what you feel today. Letting go of a role does not mean giving up. It means recognizing that it no longer serves you. It means giving yourself permission to change without needing to justify it. You too deserve rest, not just physical, but emotional rest, a break from the figure everyone knows who no longer reflects you, and no one will give you this permission if you don't give it to yourself. To stop always being the strong one, the available one. The problem solver is not failure, it is self-care. Because not everything you can do is something you must do. There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with doing, but with wanting to please. With that automatic impulse to say yes so as not to upset anyone. With smiling when you don't feel like it. With meetings that don't interest you. With conversations that no longer mean anything, but which you continue, because that's how it's always been. This way of living is quietly destructive. It forces you to be present in places where your soul has long since gone. And every time you choose yourself inwardly, but outwardly give in, something breaks inside you. Wanting to please may long have been a strategy to avoid conflicts, to keep fragile bonds, to get by. But with the years, this strategy becomes a cage in which you get used to always playing second fiddle, postponing your needs, placing others' peace above your inner peace, until one day you realize you no longer know what you want, that your decisions are dictated by the expectations of others, that you no longer recognize yourself. Breaking with this does not mean becoming hard or selfish. It means understanding that your well-being cannot forever depend on others' approval. It means accepting that sometimes you have to disappoint someone in order not to keep disappointing yourself. Choosing yourself does not mean hurting others. It means stopping the silent hurting of yourself. You don't have to explain why you're not going. You don't have to justify your tiredness. You don't have to keep enduring what has long overwhelmed you just because others have become accustomed to your constant availability. Yes, some people will be upset when you start choosing yourself. That's normal. They were used to having you always available. But love that demands constant sacrifice is not love, it's dependency. And emotional dependency, if not questioned, quickly turns into a silent form of oppression. Learning to say no is in many cases the first true expression of freedom. Not to distance yourself from the world, but to return to yourself without having to apologize for it. Nothing paralyzes as much as the thought, it's too late. Not because it's true, but because it sounds so plausible. At this age, what's the point? I don't have any energy left. If I didn't do it before, it's over now. Sentences that aren't loud but repeated so often they eventually sound like truth. But they're not. They are excuses. Excuses shaped by the logic of a long life, but also by the fear of change. Because starting something new makes you dizzy. Because leaving the familiar means risk. Because admitting that there's still a wish means realizing you haven't given up as much as you thought. It's not about denying real limits. The body changes, circumstances change, but that doesn't mean life stops. Sometimes it takes only one thing, the will. The will to try, to make mistakes, to move forward slowly, to open a door without knowing where it leads. Above all, the will not to be deceived by that inner voice that keeps insisting it no longer makes sense. How many things have you put off out of fear of not being good enough? How many wishes have you set aside because it was not the right moment? And now, with time gone by, do you really believe it's too late, or have you just gotten used to not trying? Convenience gives a sense of security, even when it makes you unhappy. It's like an old armchair, uncomfortable, worn out, but familiar. Leaving it takes effort, but staying in it day after day is a silent form of giving up. It doesn't take grand gestures, Sometimes a small decision is enough, learning something new simply out of curiosity, visiting a place you don't know yet, changing a habit, getting up 10 minutes earlier, stopping the sentence you keep repeating that always discourages you, because as long as you live, the space for change is open, and this space, however small it may seem, can transform everything. The outside also speaks. Disorder is not always accidental. It is often a visible sign of what has not been released inside. A home can tell stories, drawers full of memories, clothes never worn again, photos, letters, gifts, decorations, things that once had meaning but now only take up space. They don't disturb, but they don't nourish either. They are there, like people long gone who don't want to let go. The justifications sound familiar. It was a gift. It brings back memories. I might need it someday. It's part of my story. All may be true. And yet, what is not used, not looked at, not consciously chosen begins to weigh you down. Not because of its material value, but because of what it symbolizes: decisions never made, conversations never held, old versions of yourself you haven't yet said goodbye to. Maybe the burden isn't only material, but a shield to avoid closing old chapters. Which parts of your clutter are invisible barriers blocking your path to the new? Houses fill up like heads, out of fear of letting go, out of the belief that emptiness is dangerous. Yet emptiness, when chosen consciously, is not a threat. It is relief, fresh air, a first step back to yourself. Letting go is not a cold act. It is deeply emotional. It honors the past, but also opens the door to what is coming. You don't have to clear everything out at once. It's enough to start with one box. Look at it honestly and decide, does it deserve to still be here? Not out of guilt, not out of nostalgia, but out of truth. Because a lighter home doesn't just feel different, it breathes differently. And you too will feel lighter when your surroundings don't constantly show you who you no longer are. Something begins to quietly die when one stops learning. It doesn't show immediately, it leaves no great void, but slowly the world shrinks. Conversations repeat, thoughts harden, the environment changes, and one stands still, as if there were no longer a place in the new. One lives out of repetition, not curiosity, but curiosity is not a luxury of youth. It is a deep necessity to remain alive. Learning does not mean going back to school or gathering information. Learning at this stage of life means having the courage not to understand something and still looking, trying out a new recipe even if it fails, asking how something works without being ashamed of ignorance, listening to music you never usually hear, reading a book outside your habit, accepting help, changing your mind, admitting that even at 70 you can be wrong to dawn, and that it doesn't weaken you, it makes you human. Many confuse maturity with rigidity. They believe that because they have experienced much, they no longer need to take anything in. But life remains in motion. The world moves on, and those who close themselves off become isolated. They lose touch with younger generations. Their own perspective becomes outdated. Nothing surprises anymore. Over time, the inner light fades. Learning again is a way to rekindle this light. It's not about speed or results. It's about the attitude of constantly expanding your own world. As long as one can learn, one can change. And as long as change is possible, hope remains. Hope to understand more deeply, to feel more alive, to break a cycle that seemed eternal. Vitality is not always in the body. Often it is in the mind that keeps asking questions. It is not about being modern or adapting to everything. It is about not letting yourself be locked into what you already know. Because what is no longer questioned becomes an invisible prison. And you were not born to lock yourself inside what once worked. You were born to keep expanding. Even in small gestures, curious moments, new steps in your own world. Change at this stage of life does not seem strictly necessary. One could say, I've lived enough, I don't have to prove anything anymore. As it is, it's enough. But that is exactly where the trap lies. This sentence, which sounds so reasonable, often hides something deeper: fear. Not childish fear, not panicked terror, but a quiet fear disguised as caution. The inner voice that whispers, "Better not touch anything, it might break. Better not start anything new, it might go wrong. I'm too old for that." It is a sophisticated fear dressed as reason. It doesn't stop life loudly, but slowly extinguishes it, because what doesn't move stands still, and what stands still dies bit by bit. Rigidity, which many call stability, is not always healthy. Often it is only an elegant way of suppressing one's own desire. But change does not necessarily mean a radical break. Change often simply means letting something new in, even if it's small, even if it hurts, even if it's uncomfortable. Why is it so hard for us? Because the familiar, even if it doesn't make us happy, gives control. We know how to move within it. The new, on the other hand, forces us to be vulnerable, to say, "I don't know," to risk mistakes, to appear clumsy, to be a beginner again. But that is exactly what life is. Every time you close yourself off to a new possibility, you unconsciously tell yourself, "There is nothing left for me." And that's not true. Age does not make change impossible. It makes it more conscious, clearer, deeper. At 20, you change out of impulse. At 70, out of clarity. Because time is no longer infinite. Because it's no longer worth carrying the burden. Because you don't have to prove anything anymore. Exactly there, in this clarity, lies true transformation. Not out of duty, but out of choice. No one is forced to change, but whoever refuses the possibility remains trapped in repetition, and endless repetition is nothing but numbness. Survival, when life could still be possible. To live in peace does not mean to always have calm. It does not mean to be free of problems or to live in constant harmony. Peace in this part of life is not a perfect state. It is a practice, a daily exercise of discernment, a chosen silence, a being with oneself without feeling abandoned. True peace is not found, it is built. And often it looks very different from what one imagined in younger years. It does not mean having everything under control. Not that everyone is pleased with you, not that nothing is missing. This image of complete fullness is unattainable, and the attempt to chase it only brings unhappiness. The peace that truly matters is more sober, clearer. It lies in knowing which relationships are worth it and which no longer are. It lies in looking at your own story without hatred and without shame, in accepting that not everything can be solved, and that it still makes sense to be here. You feel peace when you no longer need to convince anyone, when you stop fighting against the unchangeable, when you let go of the obsession with how things should have been. In this moment, even if the body has limits, even if the world remains imperfect, an inner rest comes, not because everything is good, but because you have stopped fighting against the inevitable. This is not resignation. It is a mature way of saying, "This is enough for me to be okay." It does not take away your wishes, but wishing loses its desperation. It no longer arises from lack, but from connection. It does not chase the impossible, but finds a place in the essential. Finding this peace is not easy. It requires letting go, honesty, sometimes also solitude, but it gives a new gentleness, a way of being in the world that needs neither permission nor approval, only presence. And this presence is perhaps the greatest gift you can give yourself after all that survival. To live lightly does not mean to live empty, nor does it mean to be superficial or selfish. Lightness is the result of a conscious, sometimes painful process of clarification. For to lighten yourself does not mean to turn away, but to no longer carry what is no longer yours. It means to stop dragging along everything that once had meaning but no longer resonates with you today. This choice even if it seems small, deeply changes the feeling of being alive. To be light means not to react to everything, not to explain every action, not to always want to please, not to justify absence. It means to rest in your own truth without having to defend it. It means to find inner space, space to breathe, space to pause, space not to have to solve everything. Not because you do not care, but because you have understood your energy is limited, and it is no longer worth giving it to what gives nothing back. Lightness is not disinterest, but emotional maturity. It is the understanding that not everything is bearable forever. That some relationships, when they become too heavy, must be released. That some battles are not worth continuing. That some versions of yourself have finished their cycle. To live lightly means to live with what is necessary, not out of lack, but out of choice. Because you have realized that you do not need to accumulate things, duties, guilt, or broken promises. In this lies a deep dignity, a respect for yourself that is not loud but changes the way you dwell within yourself. Lightness cannot be seen, it is felt. In your breath, in your sleep, in conversations where you no longer defend yourself, in the moments when you silently let go of what no longer carries you. There is no hurry, no plan. But there is possibility. Less burden, more truth. And this possibility, quiet, unspectacular, can make the difference between mere survival and real life. All this is not an invitation to turn your whole life upside down, not a guide to instant happiness. It is something else, a pause, a quiet space to honestly look at what you are still carrying without having to. For to live with dignity does not mean to become perfect, but to reconcile with what is, with what remains, with what can still be. You have lived enough to know that not everything gets resolved, that there are losses that cannot be replaced, wounds that never fully heal, stories that find no perfect ending. But you also know there are these moments of truth, short but intense, in which you feel free without explanation. And these moments come when the weight falls, when you no longer need permission, when you stop acting out of duty and begin to live from within. Tidying up life is not a radical act. It is small, conscious gestures, a no that needs no justification, an object you let go of, a relationship that drifts away, a memory you look at one last time before releasing it. These small decisions open space, not empty space, but habitable. Space to be, to breathe, to feel again. In the end, it does not matter how much time remains. What matters is that this time belongs to you, not borrowed, not dependent on others' expectations. With everything that was, with everything that was lost, with everything that was learned, you can still begin to live differently. Not out of defiance, not out of revenge, but out of respect, out of tenderness toward yourself, out of that quiet love that arises when you stop fighting against yourself.